Mistakes I would make as a beginner is that I would make my hats too wide at the bottom, and I would forget to count my stitches. So I wouldn't count my stitches and I would crochet, and this was supposed to be, I crocheted here, and this one right here is my last stitch. So double crochet here, and if I counted my stitches according to the pattern, I would know this was my last one. But what I would do is I would go into my chain 3 and do one more double crochet, and then I would slip stitch on top of that chain 2, or if this is a chain 3, I know this one's a chain 2, and then it would get wider and wider because it was like I was doing an increase here, and instead I was only supposed to do a double crochet and stop instead of doing another one in the chain 3. So as a beginner crocheter, you need to make sure you count your stitches, or you're going to make it wider here and your hat's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I've had some crocheters ask me, why is my hat getting bigger? And I know as a beginner I was having the same issue, but I wasn't counting all my stitches. So if it says 55 double crochet and you have 56, it's because you're probably doing an extra one right here. So that's one mistake that crocheters make, and the way to correct that is to always make sure you count your stitches to make sure your stitch count is correct. Another mistake I know I've made and crocheters can make is that we make our foundation chain too tight or too loose. So it's important to follow the gauge if there's a gauge in the pattern. So if the gauge says that it's 12 double crochet and maybe you're 4 inches from here to here, and it's saying 12 double crochet in that gauge, then if you're way over it or way under it, you're probably crocheting too tight or too loose. So if you're doing this, which I'm really guilty of doing it real tight, if your tension's very tight, I'm guilty of that. Or maybe you're doing this and you're doing it way too loose. So properly is just to do it loose but not too tight, and you're wanting to do it right in between. So make sure that you're checking the gauge if the pattern comes with one, so you'll know what stitches, how many stitches are needed in the gauge, so you're not going too tight or too loose. Okay, so that's one mistake that's made in crochet. A mistake that is made in crocheting is when your foundation chain is too tight. So what happens, it starts to curl on the ends here instead of going straight. So this foundation chain, you have to make sure that you're doing it somewhat loose but not too tight, and you have to follow your gauge. So if it's telling you that you have maybe 12 double crochet in your gauge, which is like maybe 4 inches by 4 inches, and you're way over it or way under it, you're probably crocheting too loose or too tight on the foundation chain, and then your pattern's going to start curling off to the sides because it's way too tight. So you don't want to make it too tight, and sometimes you don't want to make it too loose. You want to do it right in the middle. So make sure you're checking that to make sure it's not too tight for your foundation chain. That's another mistake that crocheters make. So another mistake crocheters make is when they get to the end here, they'll double crochet in this double crochet, but then they just stop because they think this chain 3 gets skipped and it doesn't complete the edge, and then they'll turn. So it's always important to count your stitches, but you have to work into that last stitch, which is the chain 3. And that will make your edge straight. So now your edge is straight because of it. Then you can chain 3 again and turn. So it's always important to work into that chain 3 at the edge here so it makes it straight, and then count your stitches. Okay, so another mistake crocheters, maybe as beginners, make is that they work in one of the loops, so the front loop, and work their stitch, or they work in that back loop and make their stitch. It's important to make the stitch complete by working both stitches. So you have that stitch and that stitch, which is 2, looks like a V. You have to work through both of them to make a complete stitch, whether it's a single, a half, or a double. You can't work through just front unless it calls for a front or just the back loop. You want to work through both of these loops, and that's a mistake I know I've made before too. And then that completes it, unless it calls for a front loop or a back loop.